So today we are talking about redox status, and let me pull up this great diagram that I made this morning. So redox. What is redox? It is the balance between reduction, and we'll get in that in a second, and oxidation. And I try to color code this whole diagram so you can see where reduction happens and oxidation happens. Reduction is the ability of adding electrons and making something less reactive. And oxidation is adding oxidative stress to something or more oxygen. So redox in a healthy individual happens through a process called activation and detoxification. And activation and detoxification, put simply, is built into three separate ways here. All right, so just to recap real quick, we have reduction and oxidation. Reduction is the adding of electrons. Oxidation is the removal of electrons, not necessarily, but the addition of oxygen molecules. And in the body, it goes through activation, detoxification, which requires phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Phase 1 requires oxidation. Phase 2 requires reduction, and phase 3 will require excretion. We'll get to that in just a second. Now, activation and detoxification. Activation is essentially when those oxidative stressors happen in the body needs to take whatever is in the body and make it more water soluble. So it can take a fat soluble toxin, or it can make a water insoluble toxin more soluble. That way the body can excrete it and get rid of it. So a few ways that it does it is through conjugation, which is through these mechanisms here, and non-conjugation markers. So non-conjugation we'll go through first, such as Quinone Reductase, that uses NADPH. You've got another one, the Epoxide Hydrolase, which is more works on carbon bonds. And then we've got the ones that are more known and talked about, such as Glutathione S Transferase, that relies on cysteine and glycine and glutamine or glutamic acid, and that you get from eating like your sulfur groups, cruciferous vegetables that help that. It requires a sulfur group plus an electrophile, which essentially is a carbon or nitrogen together to create that. We have the more famous one, which is methylation here as well. And methylation, you've heard of MTHFR, adding methyl groups for this transaction to happen, which cofactors require like acetylenolmethionine, and other enzymes that are related to it are like COMT or TNT or histamine and methyltransferase. You've heard of HMNT, HNMT. We also have acetylation and sulfuration and glucoronidation. Acetylation basically just uses acetyl-CoA, which is part of the mitochondrial cycle. Sulfuration uses sulfur, you might have guessed, and glucoronidation uses UGTs, which are found in like the liver, all those processes. And when these all happen, depending on what toxin is introduced into the body, to create it more water soluble, it gets excreted. And when it gets excreted, that happens through three pathways primarily, which is either through a gaseous form, a liquid form, or a solid form. And our gaseous form would be us breathing. So breathing out air and getting that out. A liquid form would be urinating or sweating it out or crying it out. Defecation, which is our solid form, would be getting things out either through the stool or from the liver to the gallbladder, through the bile into the stool, and then defecating that way. That's why many people take binders. All these pathways are turned on in healthy individuals, either through hormesis. Now, hormesis is essentially the hormesis is the act of doing something that's like a stress to the body, but in a good stress so that the body recovers well and creates a beneficial response. A great example of this would be exercise. You put a little bit of stress on your body, your muscle gets a little bit stronger. At first, it gets like more tired because it's taking on this activation, but then it goes through a whole process of eventually becoming stronger. And that's what hormesis is. It activates this whole NRF2 TJ1 pathway, which downstream turns on this activation detoxification pathway in a healthy individual. Now with NRF2, DJ1, I want to point out that when we look at this, that we are, there we go. Okay, I want to point out of this that we are looking here at a dose-dependent curve. So this is a bell-shaped curve or a inverse bell curve. And we have an x-axis here and we have the y-axis here. And as the more of something, so if I were to draw in some text here just so we can see what we're talking about, I'm going to put in here, for example, toxin, the amount of toxin versus the beneficial effect. Now, the more of a toxin is required, but only up to a certain point, because once you go more of adding a toxin in, the beneficial effect goes down. So this is an inverse. This is an inverse beneficial effect. That way it's a little bit easy to understand. So if this red dot, if we were to add this much toxin, you would not get that beneficial effect. If you added too much toxin, you would not get this beneficial effect. If you were to just get the right amount, then you get the inverse beneficial effect. And this is where we get the term, which is saying the dose is the poison. All right. So once you understand that, you can see how just a little bit of a toxin or a pathogen or just a little bit of stress can activate the benefits that you get. But doing too much brings you to over-oxidation. Doing too much of anything can bring you into the oxidation. Now, proteopathy, that's just the term for misfolded proteins. That can also set off this cascade. Now let's get into the part with oxidation, over-oxidation. So things that create too much oxidative stress when this scale tips too favorably in a unfavorable way. With over-oxidation, what we get is too much either reactive nitrogen species, which trigger inducible nitric oxide synthase, and we get reactive nitrogen species, or we get reactive oxygen species, ROS, which is with too much oxygen. Now, I drew out very quickly here some very fast, like immediate fixes for the RNS or the ROS. Now, they are not going to fix everything. Let's say there's too much, but adding these back in will bring the levels of over-oxidation down. That way you can work on improving this whole side of activation detoxification. So for reactive oxygen species, we can do hydrogen water, which is a very novel way for producing hydrogen, which if you have two hydrogen molecules and one free-floating oxygen molecules, have you heard of H2O or water? Well, that's what you get when you add in H2. So that neutralizes that reaction very quickly. With reactive nitrogen species, the problem with that is that there's too much positive charge because of all this. And so adding in infrared with a bunch of negative ions will bring that charge back to neutral. If you've seen my video on infrared, you'll understand what I'm talking about there. Those are the quickest ways to bring these things back into a more homeostatic way. Now we've got more of these long-term fixes that I want to talk about. Now, by long-term fixes, I mean ways that once you've jump-started your redox status back to being more neutral, you'll have the ability to bring yourself into a more robust way to handle redox challenges in the future. So to go through these, We're going to talk about displacement of toxins. We're going to talk about adding all the correct beneficial nutritional factors that allow your body to go through this process in a healthy way. And then we're going to talk about how to enhance your detoxification excretion pathway, which is very important. That can be a bottleneck for so many people. Now, when we talk about displacing bioaccumulation, what does that even mean? So bioaccumulation is your body when it puts on and takes on foreign substances and xenobiotics. You accumulate all these biotoxins. So bioaccumulation essentially is the breakdown of, is the acquisition and accumulation of biotoxins. So bioaccumulation. And that causes you to have to use up all these extra factors to constantly trying to be able to detoxify these things, get it out of the body. So you'll use up glucoronidation factors. You'll use up your sulfur groups and your acetyl groups and your methyl groups if this gets unchecked. Now, part of the problem with this is displacement. So how toxins work in the body is that they go into, they need to, for them to stay in the body, they need to bind to something. And so they either bind to a receptor, which one of your minerals or a hormone or something would bind to, and it displaces that, where your hormone should be, or your nutrient should be, or your mineral should be, the toxin gets into there instead. And what we need to do is switch to the favorable thing. So for example, mercury will bind to the Glutathione S Transferase and displace where selenium gets taken up. Now, an easy fix for that would either be trying to bind to that mercury, or an even easier fix than that would be displacing that mercury so the mercury pops off. Then you can bind to that mercury. So what we're doing here is displacing all this first, so then we can mop it up later. Now, increasing the conjugation factors. So the conjugation factors, conjugation just means making things water soluble. And so increasing the conjugation factors would be things like adding in more sulfur groups for sulfuration. So that's your cruciferous vegetables, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, broccoli, adding in things that improve the way your body utilizes it, such as myrosinase. Myrosinase plus glucoraphanin will make things like sulforaphane. With some of these other pathways like glucoronidation, you could take beta-glucoronidase, which inhibits the enzyme that inhibits this function. So you're essentially canceling each other out. With acetylation, acetyl groups helps with that. Methylation is getting the methylation cycle in order. Things like creatine or TMG, or if you have a problem with COMT, taking SAMe, or if you have a problem with MTHFR, taking the correct B vitamins, such as choline and methylfolate. Other parts of this require understanding your status with B12, your ability to handle cobalamin. And then we have Glutathione S Transferase, which I believe most people have the biggest issues with, especially with our toxic world. And this requires glutathione to eliminate and make things more water soluble. So when you have a depletion in glutathione, your ability to eliminate foreign substances becomes significantly hindered. And a lot of problems I see specifically to, let's say, a virus that's going on around right now is people taking, when they get a fever, Tylenol, acetaminophen. And acetaminophen highly depends on glutathione S transferase for it to be cleared out of the body. Now, glutathione S transferase is also very important for the immune function to kill and stay in a homeostatic environment after it kills something. After it goes through that oxidative stress, it needs to reduce. And that's where glutathione plays a huge role. Now, if it's all being taken up with suppressing a fever with acetaminophen, then you get big downstream effects. That's why things like N-acetylcysteine is really important during an acute infection, especially if you're taking acetaminophen. This also requires glutamine and glycine. So you can get your glutamic acid from glutamine, which is awesome. Now, when we've talked about increasing the conjugation factors, we're going to last talk about how to enhance this excretion pathways here. Now, through excretion, we want the correct air. We want to be breathing out. We don't want to be repolluting our lungs. So we want to make sure that we're breathing. We're doing belly breathing. We're doing it through the nose. We're doing all those pathways correctly, but we're also, our air quality, whether it's indoor air quality or outdoor air quality, is not hindering this process. And then when it comes from, we're talking about the liquid form, we're talking about urination or sweating. So first through urination is making sure that you're taking the correct minerals, because the correct minerals are going to bind to those things. For example, halogens, they bind to sodium, such as sodium chloride, you know? So you need sodium in your diet to pee out halogens. There are herbs that can enhance the excretion if you have incontinence problems or problems getting the flow going. Sweating is a very interesting one, because sweating not only is moving things around through your largest system, your largest organ, but also takes a load off the lymph system at the same time. And if you preload that whole sweating situation, whether you're going on a run, or you're going to go into the sauna and you do dry brushing or rebounding, you're getting that lymph to move that stuff to the excretion pathways. And so that's a way to optimize your sweating regimen. Lastly, we have defecation. Now, defecation is a huge problem because of the standard American diet, which promotes a low fibrous diet and a diet that does not allow you to pass stools efficiently. What is really important for passing stools is your bile excretion. Bile is like the lubricant of your intestines, and it allows things to smoothly pass through. Even though you have gastroparesis, which is the muscular moving of food through your digestive tract, you still need that lubricant to help move it through. And a lot of people have stagnant liver or stagnant gallbladder, or the biliary is way too, the biliary system produces bile that's way too thick. And so you've got stagnant bile and very clunky oil, very thick and viscous oil, does not allow your engine to run properly. So the same thing happens with bile in your gut. So first of all, getting bile, thin bile that is able to freely flow, and bile that is pushing out in a timely fashion, a functional fashion that is timed correctly from when it's being produced in the liver, when it's getting signaled from receptors in the stomach to be released, so it can bind with the appropriate food. And the appropriate food is now where we get into this other part about the SAD diet, is that the lack of fiber is non-existent. So there needs to be fiber, or something that the bile can bind to, because it can re-enter circulation into the liver through the gastroenteric hepatic circulation, which occurs in the colon. So to eliminate bile, which bile is essentially not only is it used to break down fat, but it also carries toxins that your liver has in it that is trying to excrete through defecation. And so when you have a lot of fiber, the bile can bind to that fiber. It creates a electric charge through the form of adsorption. So it essentially, the food just engrosses it. Now with binders, that can happen with absorption where it creates an actual charge, or there's even binders where you can create covalent charges, which create a bond that can't break apart until you poop it out. So getting that in order is proper to that. A lot of people do things like try to enhance their ability to create bile more viscous, such as taking like milk thistle. Another way to increase the excretion of that bile is with cofactors that build up bile, like TUDCA, or even ways that provoke bile, such as bitters, or people have go even extreme as to get caffeic acid and other byproducts. Don't quote me on the exact terms for them, but for like coffee enemas, because that also increases excretion of bile. But it depends on your exploratory you're willing to explore multiple options to see what you can use to compound a beneficial effect. So today we discussed redox, which is the balance between reduction and oxidation. And in healthy people, you have proper activation and detoxification, which allows you to take things that are toxic, make them more water soluble, and excrete them out properly, whether it's through breathing, or it's through respiration, or it's through a liquid format, which would be peeing or sweating or crying, or through a solid form, which would be through fiber or a binder through defecation. All right. And we are going to pull over to if anyone has any questions.